to be enmeshed in people's life, that's what it's been. It's loving and leading a local church with real people, with real names, and real faces, with real funerals and real weddings and real conflict and real political events that I didn't preach about and real political events that I did preach about, and making those choices and sorting all of that out, I think gives writing a texture, which I hope translates to readers, a texture that just doesn't feel so generic. It's not anyone. A principle in writing is that we often, any speaking communicators, that you often feel like, okay, if I'm generic, it'll speak to everybody, but it's often the concrete in particular that really moves people.
Hello, my name is Adsum, and this is the Consider the Ravens podcast. We believe that discipleship should happen primarily within the context of the local church, but that the principal way that has been bolstered throughout church history is through literature, whether fiction, non-fiction. From letters to works of systematic theology, literature helps us to understand the word and to get to know the world we live in.
Hello, and I'm Anna, and it is our absolute pleasure to have Benjamin with us today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yay! So, just a quick introduction, and Benjamin, you can jump in if I miss anything important.
Okay.
You are the husband to Brooke and father to 6 children. So you live in Harrisburg? Yeah.
There you go. You got it.
Perfect. You live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where you are the teaching pastor of Community Evangelical Free Church. You're also the author of multiple books and the head editor for GCD, where you host the Writers Coaching Corner.
Oh, we can breathe now. That's a lot.
Very good, Stevie.
Yeah.
So first of all, we mentioned that you've written quite a few books, and the 2 that we've read and we're going to be drawing a bit from today were Shepherds and Sheep and Blogging for God's Glory in a Clickbait World. So I'd love just to hear a little bit more about that. What inspired you to write them?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for asking. So the Blogging for God's Glory in a Clickbait World, the original title was just Blogging for God's Glory. And I think it turned out that one was co-authored with a friend of mine named John Beeson. And we added the in a clickbait world because in a sense, it gave us a sparring partner. I think it made the book, I'm biased, but more interesting in that, like, okay, there's a backdrop here that we all inhabit that is at times repulsive and at times compelling, that like we feel the need. I feel the need as a writer, blogger, kind of person with words to be catchy and short and pull people in, and this hunger for metrics that is very real and in some ways could be stewarded well for God's glory. And so that's how that one came to be titled that way. But I would back up to say, how did it become a book? I was just 7-8 years ago started blogging in secret and which is not normally the way people would suggest to blog. You normally don't blog in secret, and no one was persecuting me. I was not part of this underground blogging community. I was just afraid. I was not good with words. Yeah. I grew, I was saying before that I grew up as in kind of a math science guy and did engineering. And part of me coming to know the Lord was awakening to books and literature that happened in college. And so I finished my engineering degree and did engineering for a while and did seminary a little bit after that or during that. But it was a very poor reader and writer. I struggled there. And so I'll go quicker here, but essentially through the crucible of seminary, learned I loved words and I loved writing, and I wasn't very good at it, but wanted to pursue it. So that's how I started blogging in secret. And then I realized, once you start not blogging in secret and want people to read, it still sort of feels like you're blogging in secret because people aren't reading. And so it was a lot of wrestling internally with what does it mean to gather an audience and what ways would that be good? What ways would that be bad? So that's that book. The other book, Shepherd and Sheep, over the last 7-8 years, I've probably written about 85 articles for various websites across kind of the internet landscape, from bigger places that we all might have heard of and some that are small and not heard of. But through that, I kind of was on sabbatical last summer at my church, and I was thinking through what might be a gift back to them. And so I put kind of the best ones together in a book, and it's not a big deal in a sense, but to us it was meaningful. And we had some book studies out of it to really think through a lot of really give back and say, okay, these things grew up in our relationship together. I learned these things while I spent time with you, and over the last 7 years, and so I put those together. And we've been reading them together.
Oh, I love that. That's such a lovely idea. That's really great.
Thank you.
I'm really curious. This is already going off script. So classic us. You said that you leaned more into maths and science. Do you think that has influenced the way that you've written at all?
Well, it probably does. I do, but so when I was first interviewing for my role at my first church, which is not the one I'm at, I've been at 2 on staff, that I was an engineer was not something that endeared them to me. And so I want to say, they were like, they had a stereotype. Okay, this, I think one of the first compliments I got when I got there that I really appreciated was, you're an engineer, but not the kind we expected. And I'm not trying to make fun of all engineers. I am one. So when I say, like, I think the engineering background influences my writing, I don't want to have no one ever read what I've written because they project what that would mean. So it does. I do try and, maybe the logical part of flow and sentence and paragraph, but what's been fun is to be more playful and artful, things that you can't do necessarily in strict papers and engineering and academic mindset.
Great.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. Talking of writing, for those of you at home, we usually talk about reading on this podcast, but as you may have gathered, we're talking a lot about writing today, and getting to talk to a writer and kind of get Benjamin's heart behind that. Benjamin, as we've mentioned, is not just a writer, but a pastor, somebody with a pastoral heart. And we're hoping that will come through today. What we're hoping that you'll get, listeners at home, is to love writers themselves, like to know how to support writers, to know how to read writers, to know who writers are, that books aren't just written and blogs aren't just written by just random robots online, but are actually, real people. And to that end, we think that you've given an absolutely wonderful explanation of pastoral work in your book, Shepherds and Sheep, as we've said. But although you're talking to pastors, we think that there's tons in there that applies to writers. But what do you think are principles from that book that would be really important for writers?
That's a great question. I think one thing that came out of that, and it wasn't necessarily intentional, I didn't choose here's the things that should be done on writers, but I can just speak to what's been helpful to me is a rootedness in a local church, and to see, for me, home base is pastoral ministry in a local church. But out of that, you learn things, and so sharing that with a view to sharing and encouraging, kind of this, like you said, that blogs aren't written just by robots. There are other pastors and authors and men and women who love the Lord, who are taking what they've learned and sharing that with others. And so, I think to be enmeshed in people's lives, the Shepherd and Sheep, so the essays on loving and leading in a local church, I is a subtitle. That's what it's been. It's loving and leading a local church with real people, with real names and real faces, with real funerals and real weddings and real conflict and real political events that I didn't preach about and real political events that I did preach about. And making those choices and sorting all of that out, I think gives writing a texture, and which I hope translates to readers a texture that just doesn't feel so generic. It's not anyone. A principle in writing is that we often, any speaking, communicating, is that you often feel like, okay, if I'm generic, it'll speak to everybody, but it's often the concrete in particular that really moves people.
Oh, there are so many points I want to ask you questions about, but I will try and.
Well, I got time. I don't know the length of your podcast. I'm just here, so
I will try. I will try and calm myself. So we'll do this a little bit more organized, which is not very like me at all. Yeah, you did an excellent definition of blogging for God's glory. You said, firstly, to have our motivations aligned with God's, and secondly, to pursue excellence in the craft, including theological precision, beautiful prose, visual appealment, and the edification of readers, all drawing from the best industry practices. So just want to chat first of all a bit about how to glorify God. and then we'll go on about pursuing excellence. But firstly, how do you think these two influences have affected your writing and pastoring? You've mentioned a bit already, but yeah.
Well, thanks for reading that. That is an attempt at a definition for blogging at God's glory. What would blogging for God's glory look like? And you can remove blogging and put in a few other things. They might work there as well. But I do think there's a heart component, motivation level component that is aligned with God's heart and motivation and aim for the world. And then there's you're doing it well, and whatever well looks like is somewhat subjective, but there are some things that are identifiable. And so for me, part of that definition and how we got to that, John and I, was more looking at, there are people who are ignoring either one of those at times. And their heart is right, and golly, they want to serve the Lord, but it's really an ugly blog with pictures that are stolen, and they only blog every 4 months, and then they talk about it on Facebook for 9 weeks. And so you're like, okay, that these are not the best industry practices, and I know you love the Lord and you're trying to do it well, but you're not. So that's how that definition, I think, came to be kind of sorted out. And I think actually it's useful to think about it in those two categories. There's not just one or the other. When it comes to blogging for God's glory, like the glory part and motivation part, there's a number of layers to that. And there's just all sorts of ways to get it wrong, isn't there? I mean, you guys are doing a podcast. What would it mean to podcast for God's glory at a heart level? Right? I'm sure there's things that are thought through there, right?
Yeah,
that's
totally something we think about a lot.
I wrote an article a little while ago about why I write, and this really resonates with me. I wrote, essentially, I write to love God and love people. Those are my main cues. And what we found as we've expanded that to podcasting is very much the same thing. We're sitting down going, actually, or when we're writing to an author or a guest or something to say, will you come on our podcast? We start off by saying, how can we be a blessing to you? We hope that this message will be a blessing to you, whether or not you come on, and things like that. Because actually, I think what we find, or what I've found at least, especially talking to other writers, to other artists, to other poets, to other all sorts of different creative people across the board, is that their purpose behind writing, their motivation behind writing. Daddy long legs.
I'm really sorry, I ruined that. There was a ladybug that just flew into my face.
I was really on a roll there.
I know you were doing really well.
I'm so sorry, Benjamin. This will be a great outtake. It's fine. I'll put this on YouTube.
Totally fine. Ladybugs, you're good.
So sorry. Where was I? So artists, writers, poets, whatever it is, their motivation comes out of and springs out of who they are as a person, who they are in God, their identity in Christ. And if we're called to love people, to love God, if we believe that the chief end of man, for instance, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, and if we believe that that should have an effect on who we how we treat other people, then that will come out in our writing, hopefully. And I think one thing I'd ask, and especially for helping readers to read writers' work, one thing that really comes across to me is that when I'm on Twitter, or when I'm reading people's work, and especially people's work that I know, but with whom I might disagree with, I know their motivation behind it is very similar to this. I know that they disagree with me. Maybe they're writing specifically to disagree with me or to disagree with the point that I hold. But actually, I know that they still love me, and that the reason they're writing about it is because of that on most occasions, or to be charitable when we're trying to believe that everyone does. What ways do you think that comes out, especially when you're writing things that might be more polemic, might be slightly more apologetic? How do you go about trying to love people even when you're disagreeing with them?
Well, I hope I do that. I want to be someone who does those things that you're describing there. So a few things probably keeping in mind is, I think, to understand the real arguments you're actually arguing with. I think there's a caricature, and straw man is the word that's often used, of just okay, you're not actually talking to what the real person actually believes. And I think there's a real tendency in blogging and sometimes corporate communication, I don't mean corporate business, but just communications to rooms and audiences, that ostensibly it looks like you're speaking to people that disagree with you, but really you're just using all the rally cry words and language that the people who already believe what you believe can applaud you on your back and say, you did this on their turf, and you told them what's what. It's the YouTube kind of videos trope of so and so slams or so and so owns his opponent or her opponent, and you're just like, is that really the goal of communication? I don't think so. I don't think godly communication does it. So that's part of not just the best industry practices, but what is Christian communication? It has to not only align at a heart level of motivation. I want to honor God, but like it actually has to honor the people that God loves as you speak with them. So there's probably a lot there, but I think starting with what the people actually believe and really speaking to the people who are in front of you in a way that they can hear it and embrace what you're writing or speaking about.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really great. I think that's really important that we keep that in mind, that actually, yeah, if we're arguing for argument's sake, then everything will look like a nail if we're a hammer. And it's just like, yeah, that's really important to remember. Another point that we'd love to discuss is that idea of pursuing excellence, that we need to be slow to speak and discerning, especially in an age when reactive viral posts are spread like crazy. How do you think that writers can be edifying in the way that they write, looking to build readers up, and do so in a way that is excellent and beautiful?
Oh, I that's I like that you put two things together there, because they have one answer, perhaps, or at least one way to answer it helps solve both of those. One is the slow to speak and how to write beautifully, and they both involve editors. Now, I don't want to just justify my own existence as something that I do part-time is edit articles, but one of the major critiques of blogging that I believe is legitimate is that it is this kind of single author, straight to the World Wide Web or the Wild West, here in America. It's just anybody can say whatever they want, whenever they want to say it. And there's no way to verify it. There's no filter. And, I think with a big organization with lots of bloggers and lots of editors and whatnot, like that gets huge. Not GCD, our Gospel Centered Discipleship website that I work for, but like something really big, like, okay, it can be stifling. There's too many voices. Like you can't ever be unique. And like, but that is not the normal fear with the average blogger. They can say whatever they want. And the problem is they don't have a filter. They don't have an editing team, whether a professional one to look at it or just a peer group of friends who would share that editing. And I think, so that's how it also, I think, speaks to the other part of the question of how do I write beautifully? You can get there on your own over time, sort of like following the Lord. We're conformed to the image of Christ as we follow him on our own, in a sense. But God's plan is the church and discipleship, and to use a proverb, iron sharpening iron, which can be messy and involves, shaving off the rough parts. And I think that's what editors do. That's what a filter does. However, if it's not just formal editing. And so that's one way I think we can really step up our game as bloggers, is recruiting and inviting people to participate with us behind the scenes, so that what is in front of people is actually as good as it can be.
That's amazing.
Which also fits in really well to what you said about being part of the local church and about how important that is. And that is one of the things you said, isn't it, about actually how, I can't remember the quote exactly, but you said something along the lines of when you blog, you should do it within the context of
a rootedness in a local church. Rooted with people. I think the idea of a solo blogger who's just out there to discern things and influence the world is dangerous, wrong, I don't know, unhelpful, all sorts of things, wild, and it can feel, energetic. It's you against the world, and there's kind of a caffeine induced element to that. It feels good to be a prophet like Amos calling down the thunder of the Lord. And, but I just think that's good. But design is to be rooted in local churches among people. And
definitely. Yeah.
So let me just kind of say one thing about that too.
Yeah.
A part of that, the double side of that. So how it's kind of, you oscillate between the two definitions there or aspects of the definition: belonging for God's glory, heart motivation, character alignment, but then professionalism, editors, all those sorts of things, best practices in the industry, learning, reading. The way, editors kind of play into the best practice, but then, you have to be able to receive that editing. And I have to be able to receive that. I right now I'm going through a writing experience that's a very discouraging one. I don't know how much I want to talk about it here on the show, but part of that is what is in my heart? I'm not receiving this editing and feedback in the way I should be. And so that's how I think those definitions, they can be teased apart, but they often, I think, seen rightly, go together.
Yeah, I have been on the end of your editing pen for a couple of my articles, and I actually have to say I quite enjoy being edited. Personally,
you're a humble, godly man.
Yeah, well, no, but in all honesty, I much prefer somebody else editing my work than editing myself, and that can be really hard because I know that I need to do more self-editing, and even at the moment going through old articles and trying to figure out, what can I use from this and whatnot, going, I've already got to rewrite some of this and this is talking 3-4 months ago, just to collate this into a PDF for something. And what tips do you have for self-editing? I'm trying to get better at this, and I'm sure lots of people at home are doing exactly the same. What tips do you have?
Yep. I'll give a few real briefly. One, as much time as you can get separation from what you've written. If it's an email, maybe a half hour is sufficient. If it's a blog post, maybe a day is sufficient, maybe a week. I understand there's such a thing as deadlines. I get that. But whatever time you can allow, I think, is very helpful. You see it like you're describing here. You're looking at old posts from 4 months ago, and yet in 4 months' time, you both have perspective and maybe even, in a sense, growth as a writer. So time is helpful. I think printing out in a very digital world where I think our eyes are just accustomed to skimming. And so printing out often, studies show, I think there can be a comparable level of reading quality in either, but in general, we tend to try to go faster on screens. And that's actually what limits our ability to not only self-help, but just read with comprehension. So printing out, going slowly with a pen in hand. And then I use this, a little trick for me, maybe that's what, so the third one would be just software beyond just Word. There's other softwares you can bring in. I tend to like Grammarly. I get no kickbacks, but I've paid for a software that does a little deeper editing. The last one, it's so helpful to me, and I use it all the time, and I should use it more than I do, but I use the electronic reader, whether on my PC, desktop, computer, or an iPhone or something like that, to read it back to me, what I've written, because it's often in the actual, I can print it out and try and read every word, but it's not until a wooden and mechanical don't get it, but you get what I'm saying. An electronic reader reads actually every word in the order they're written. It's often then that I really find a lot of the typos that I never would have seen. Again, we're just speaking purely self-editing. Those are a lot of the steps I try and do on important emails or certainly blog posts and books.
I agree. And I was actually going to say, because you edited a few of my husband's work, that's why we've got you on the Zoom here, so we can talk to you.
Oh, okay.
Man to man, just
really. Yeah, that's funny. There was actually this time you added a comma, and I'm not gonna, we're gonna go back and forth about a comma or something. Yeah, that's funny.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on something you said a little bit earlier about and something that you've also mentioned in your writing in the book about actually not just being reactive about current events. And it was actually John who wrote it in the blogging no, not blogging in the blogging in the clickbait world. He says, I want to write posts that can be read a few years later and still be meaningful to the reader, to provide a voice different than the news cycle. I just wanted to mention that quote. I thought it would be interesting to hear from you. I mean, I'm hoping that you also agree with him.
Oh, I do. Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking through every line and word and when editing each other.
And
no, I have. And then we hired professionals to get the ones we missed, of course. So yeah, I agree with that quote. I think it's great. I think it's true in pastoral ministry and writing. There's a sense in which okay, it's good sometimes to speak to current events. I get it, but there's also, and I'm thinking more in a local church context, but I trying to give the gift to our church that we are not as current as whatever their favorite news outlet is that morning. There is a slowness and a because I just don't know how I'd survive as a pastor and a writer if I was constantly forced to be relevant, current, trendy, pertinent, electric in all those ways. That to me it would be exhausting. And so the name for that content in a writing world is they would generally call it evergreen, meaning it's like the trees that don't lose their leaves. It's just always green. This post about loving a husband who is hard to love because he doesn't like to be edited, that's always green. No, I'm teasing here, but
sorry. Can you send that to me, please? Because
oh, you like that? Yeah. So yeah, so I think there's a real sweetness to that. Now, that's not to say I'm not helped by, okay, this is a moment for our culture and time, and I'm so thankful for the voices that can speak to it. But I do find that the voices I appreciate the most, who speak to current events the best, are actually the ones in my mind. How can I perceive somebody's character? I don't know, but I perceive them to be the people who are men and women of deep character and rootedness in the fruits of the Spirit. And even if they're just secular, so to speak, they're not even speaking Christian white, but they're people who are not clickbait. They're trying to actually give a thoughtful representation of this current event. And so even when people are speaking current events, I think it grows best out of the soil of character.
I agree. There was
Absolutely.
Another great quote that I highlighted. I also printed it out and highlighted all the things that I liked. And it said that when pastors major on the urgent, we can inadvertently lead people to forget that the word of our God stands forever. That's from Isaiah. And I just thought that's really true about what you said. I think often we're going a bit talking about discipleship as well, which we're both really passionate about seeing. And although this is a bit, that's not quite blogging, it's actually talking a bit about actually how not just reacting all the time, but actually slowly teaching people about discerning, like when you see something on the news or when something happens, actually not reacting really quickly, but going back to God and everything like that.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing on this podcast is looking through Reformed Dogmatics by Herman Bavinck. And yeah, during the study and the research for that, I've read things from Gerhardus Voss and Kuyper and Bavinck and other Dutch reformers. And what's really interesting is how pertinent some of these things are right at this moment in time, and how actually the gospel being evergreen is so important for us as we look to permanence. Actually, is what I'm writing going to be relevant? Well, if I'm writing about the gospel, if I'm writing from what I believe the Bible is saying, then hopefully. And on the flip side of that, I heard I went to a day of seminars on preaching a while back, and the man who was leading the seminars said something to the effect of, as soon as you use a pop culture reference in your sermon, you are already out of date. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And though I don't totally agree with that, I wouldn't say that you should never do that. I did get his meaning, that he was essentially saying, look, like, don't try and be current all the time, because what you think is current might not actually be current. People are going to have different views on things. And like some Gen Z is going to come in and go, oh my goodness, dad that came out 5 years ago or whatever it is. And actually, that can be very much the same with our blogging. Do you want to say anything about that?
I agree. It's sort of it's about a diet. I think there's a helpfulness to trying to address the world we're all living in, but the world we all living in, if the biggest problems in the world begin in the human heart, man, then the Bible has a lot to say to that. And so being a Bible guy, a gospel gal is really what matters most. As far as how you major on things. Now, I'm not trying to discredit those who are doing thoughtfully. Okay, this is my niche. I am actually good at it. Partly why I just hesitate to speak culturally very quickly is I'm not very good at it. I'm very slow. I live in what's called Pennsylvania, and there's kind of perception that Amish is a kind of rural people who live here in Pennsylvania. And there are some that are actually truly Amish, but I've made the jokes years, even before I moved to Pennsylvania, that I'm relatively Amish when it comes to current events. And so I'm just not very good at it. So maybe that's why I say people shouldn't do it. But
I can't remember who it was. I was messaging a podcast guest a while back, and he was from the States, and he said, what's the time difference? And I was so close to writing, we're about 20 years ahead of you. Because you're right, different places can be in very different different time zones. Century-wise, all sorts of things. So that's really interesting. With that said, we are going to wrap up. It's been so good having you. We've been really encouraged by it. I know I, as a writer, have been encouraged by this. If you're at home and you are thinking, I get you, I totally understand that blogging is a viable, realistic form of writing that can encourage discipleship. I don't know how beneficial it would be for my life. Would you have anything to say to those people that might help?
It might not be. I mean, I don't want to push people into it. I think just because others do it and seem to find a joy in it. I'm not a big prayer journal Bible person. Like I need to journal my thoughts. I don't. And so I don't want someone to press what this non kind of canonical like thing that we have to do. Canonical meaning it's like it's not prescribed in the Bible. This is what all good Christians do. All good Christians don't blog. But I do think for me, working through what the Lord is teaching me and sharing that with others is a biblical thing. And for me, one of the ways to do it is writing. And you might be surprised there as you dabble in it. Others might be surprised at how much it does mean to them. And there's simple ways to start with simple free websites that don't have to be as big and professional as they might be someday. I just encourage if people have any desire to try to just write a few articles, share them with the pastor and small group kind of discipleship groups you have at your local church. There's some people that have been doing it here in my own local church recently. They're showing me some blog posts they're writing. A person who's kind of thinking about transitioning from one career into ministry is just, hey, I wrote these things. Are these like good or not? And I'm not asking you to edit them, but just read and tell me what you think. And so I think that's a sweet way to start, is just with the people you're around and get good feedback there.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, thank you so much for chatting us. Really, really appreciate you taking time out to do that. And I found it really interesting as well. Just before we finish, how can people find you? Any social media, blogs, books?
Yep, that's the question at the end of blogging or podcast is how can people find you? And I know you just want a crisp answer here, and we can wrap up the show. They can show up at our church in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. That would be the best way to get to know me.
Love that.
And find me.
What's your address, credit card number,
Social Security, passport. So that would be the best way. I have access to all the social media things and have accounts there. I'm holding a grudge at social media right now. And so I'm not on them as much as I was in the past. And that's a whole nother conversation. But people can totally find me. I still check them and occasionally creep something out there. But my own blog is just benjaminvrbicek.com. Or if you can't spell that, which most people can't, it's Fan and Flame. gift.com gets there at the same place. That's a kind of a verse I draw from the Bible, where Paul tells Timothy to fan into flame the gift. And so for me, writing is I hope is this way to fan into flame other people's joy in God and the gospel. And so that would get back to all my stuff.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Or you could go to Amazon and say, just buy all the books that have my name behind them. That would be the other way, but you could start for free on my blog and we can hang out for a while. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you very much. Grace and peace.